Buenos días a todos. Yo soy María Calderón, asociada del Instituto México
Good
del Wilson
morning,
Center,
everyone.
ubicado
My
en
name is
Washington,
Maria
D.C.
Calderon, an
Como
associate
muchos de
at the
ustedes ya
Wilson
saben,
Center's
el
Mexico
Wilson
Institute,
Center fue
located
creado
in
en
Washington, D.C.
1968
As many
como
of
un
you
monumento
already
al
know, the
presidente
Wilson Center was
estadounidense Woodrow
created in
Wilson y es uno
1968
de los centros
as
de
a memorial
pensamiento
to
apartidistas
U.S.
más
President Woodrow
destacados en Estados
Wilson
Unidos
and is one of
y
the
se
most
dedica a desarrollar
prominent
propuestas de
nonpartisan
política
think
pública
tanks in the
a través de
U.S.
investigaciones
It is dedicated to
independientes y
developing
diálogos
public policy
constructivos.
proposals
El
through
Instituto México es
independent
uno de los
research
14
and
programas que
constructive
engloba el
dialogues.
Wilson Center y se
The
enfoca en
Mexico
fortalecer la
Institute is
relación
one of the 14 programs
bilateral entre
that the
México
Wilson
y
Center
Estados Unidos.
encompasses and focuses
La
on
elección
strengthening
celebrada
the
el pasado
bilateral
1 de junio
relationship
de
between Mexico
2024
and the
fue el
United
proceso
States.
electoral
The
más
election held
importante y
on June
complejo
1st,
en la historia de nuestro
2024 was
país.
the most
En el
important
evento de
and
hoy,
complex
nuestros
electoral
panelistas
process in the
explorarán sus
history of our
consecuencias
country. At
electorales
today's
alrededor de
event,
dos
our
ejes
panelists will
principales:
explore
la
its
integración de ambas
electoral
cámaras del Congreso de
consequences
la Unión
around two main
y el uso de
axes:
la
the
sobrerepresentación.
integration of
Y
both
en segundo
chambers of
lugar,
the Congress of the
las
Union
consecuencias
and
de
the
dicha
use of
integración legislativa frente a la
overrepresentation.
propuesta de
And
reformas
secondly, the
constitucionales. El
consequences
evento
of
de hoy
such
forma parte de una
legislative
serie de
integration
seminarios
in the face
virtuales
of the
sobre
proposal for
diversos temas
constitutional
electorales
reforms.
que el Instituto
Today's event is
México ha
part of a
organizado
series of
para analizar
webinars
los
on various
resultados de
electoral
los comicios
topics
del
that the
pasado 1 de
Mexico
junio.
Institute has
Es por
organized to
ello que quiero
analyze the
agradecer a
results
nuestros
of the
ponentes
June 1st
por estar aquí con
elections.
nosotros para discutir las
This is why I
implicaciones
would
del
like to
proceso
thank our
electoral
speakers
más
for being
relevante
here
en la
with
historia
us to
reciente
discuss
de
the
México.
implications
Tenemos
of
una
the
mesa
most
redonda de
relevant
lujo.
electoral
Nos
process in
acompañan
Mexico's recent
representantes
history.
de
We have a
diversos
luxury
ámbitos.
round table.
Carla
We're
Humphrey Jordan,
accompanied by
consejera electoral
representatives
del
from
Instituto
various
Nacional
fields.
Electoral.
Carla Humphrey
Javier
Jordan,
Martín
electoral
Reyes,
counselor of the
investigador de la
National
Universidad
Electoral
Autónoma de
Institute.
México.
Javier Martín
Luis
Reyes,
Fernández,
researcher
secretario
at the
técnico
Autonomous University of
del
Mexico.
National Agreement
Luis
for Electoral
Fernandez,
Integrity,
technical
ANIE,
secretary
y
of the
nuestro
National
excelente
Agreement
moderador,
for Electoral
Antonio
Integrity,
Garrastazu, director
ANE,
senior para América Latina y el
and our
Caribe
excellent
del
moderator,
International
Antonio
Republic
Garastasio,
Institute,
Senior
IRI.
Director for Latin America
De
and
acuerdo a
the
los
Caribbean
principios
at the
y al espíritu
International
del Wilson
Republic
Center,
Institute,
nuestro
IRI.
objetivo hoy es entablar
In
una
accordance
plática
with the
constructiva,
principles and the
en la
spirit
cual
of the
cada
Wilson
participante
Center,
pueda
our goal
exponer sus
is to engage
opiniones
in a
y
constructive
análisis sobre la
conversation in
composición
which
del nuevo
each
poder
participant
legislativo,
can present
las
his
consecuencias
or
de la
her opinions and
sobrerepresentación
analysis on
y
the
la visión que
composition of the new
ella o él tiene para
legislative
el futuro
branch,
de México,
the consequences
así
of
como un
the
análisis de las
overrepresentation,
decisiones
and the vision
electorales
they might
durante el
have for the
proceso
future of
del
Mexico,
2024.
as well as an
Antes de
analysis
empezar la
of the
plática,
electoral
quiero
decisions
recordarle a
during
nuestra
the
audiencia
2024
que contamos con
process.
traducción simultánea.
Before we begin
En
the
la esquina derecha
conversation,
de
I
la
want
parte
to remind
inferior de
our
su
audience
pantalla
that we have
deben de ver una
simultaneous
imagen de un
interpretation.
globo.
In
Al
the
presionar
right
el globo
corner
podrán
of the
escoger el idioma de su
bottom of your
preferencia.
screen, you will
De
see
igual
a
forma,
icon
nuestra
of a
audiencia podrá
globe
enviar preguntas
that
a
will
nuestros
allow you to
ponentes
choose the language
por
of your
medio de nuestra
preference.
cuenta X,
Likewise,
arroba
our
Mexico
participants will
Institute,
be
o
able
a
to
nuestro
send
correo
questions
electrónico
to our speakers through
mexico
our
arroba
X account
wilsoncenter.org.
at Mexico
También podrán poner
Institute
sus
or
preguntas
to
en
our
el chat de
email
esta reunión de Zoom.
Mexico
Para terminar, haremos una
Institute
sesión de preguntas y respuestas de
WilsonCenter.org.
la audiencia.
You can
Sin
also
más por
send
el
your
momento,
questions through
iniciamos
the Zoom
con
meeting,
el
and at
webinar
the
y les doy
end,
la
we will
bienvenida a
have a
todos. Muchas
Q&A
gracias.
session. Let's start with our webinar. Welcome, everyone.
Muchas
Thank you.
gracias, María, por esa presentación y gracias a todos y todas por
Thank
estar
you very
con
much,
nosotros
Maria,
el
for
día de hoy
this
para hablar
introduction,
sobre
and thank you,
temas
everyone, for
bien
being with us
complejos y
today
decisivos
to
que
talk
podríamos llamar la
about very
democracia.
complex
Como dijo
and
María, vamos a
decisive
tener una
issues
oportunidad
for
de
democracy.
intercambiar con los
As
participantes.
Maria
Yo
said,
les voy a hacer unas
we'll have
preguntas,
the
vamos a poder tener una
opportunity
oportunidad de tener unas preguntas con
to
nuestra
have an
audiencia.
exchange
Pero antes de
with the
empezar,
participants. I'll be
cada
asking
uno
some questions.
pueda
The
exponer
participants will
unas
be able to
palabras
ask questions as well, but
sobre
before we
el tema
begin,
de
I
la
would like
presentación.
for each of
Así
us
que me
to
gustaría
say
darle
a
la
few
palabra a la
words about
consejera
the
Carla
topic
Humphrey
at
para
hand.
poder empezar.
So
Consejera,
first
por
of all,
favor.
I'd like to give the floor to Councillor
Buenos días
Carla
a
Humphrey
todas y
to
a
get
todos.
started.
La verdad es que agradezco mucho la invitación a
Thank you.
participar
Good
en este
morning,
evento en un tema,
everyone.
bueno, pues,
I am
muy
very
relevante
grateful
como son las
for
elecciones en México,
being
que todavía
here
estamos
and
en
being
pues,
able
los
to
últimos días
participate
de
at
este
this
proceso
event to
electoral
talk
que aún
about
está en
a
marcha.
relevant issue that are the elections in
Bueno,
Mexico.
pues
We're
hay
still in the
muchas
last
cosas,
days of
digamos,
this
que están
electoral
pasando, pero creo
process,
que agosto es un
and
mes muy
there
relevante
are
por dos razones.
many
Primero,
things
la
that keep
planificación de la
happening,
elección
but I do think
presidencial,
that August is a very
que
important
claramente
month.
tiene que
First of
ver
all,
con
due to the
pues,
qualification
cómo
of
se
the
resuelven
president
todos los juicios, todas las
presidential
impugnaciones
section that has to do with how we can get ahead with the trials, impeachments. There are several impeachments due to the presidential election. And second, which has been a subject of debate in our country since June 2nd, I would say, because we have done something new for the first time, which is a quick count to see how the Congress of the Union was integrated. It was a quick count for the deputies before, but now we've done it for the Senate and for the Chamber of Deputies. And this has given us great advances into the discussion of how the Congress of the Union would eventually or estimated be integrated. We have been analyzing and discussing and reflecting on this for over 2 months and a half and see how it could be integrated, because we're still going through some challenges in the superior chamber, so there is no final decision yet. And regarding the qualification, I would like to state that our country has changed the way it has scored or qualified the elections, and this is because specifically for the presidential one, and it's because of the files we have and the conditions in which how the electoral matters were held, and if they comply with the legal framework and how they need to be based on the guiding principles. Our type of qualification has varied over the years. We have changed from the self-qualification between 1917 and 1993, in which our federal chambers would score their own elections, and then the Chamber of Deputies itself was governed in the Electoral College in order to qualify the election at that time. And at that time, the head of the executive branch in 1993, the Electoral Tribunal was created, the Federal Electoral, also known as TRICOE, that extinguished the self-qualification by the legislators, by the lawmakers. This court qualified these elections, but the Electoral College was maintained in the Chamber of Deputies, and it was them that qualified the 1994 elections, by the way, in which we have had the highest participation in recent years, with 77%. The year in which we have achieved the greatest participation in the country. Later on, in 1996, we have the creation of the Electoral Tribunal of the Judicial Branch of the Federation, as we know it now. It means that it's part of our judicial branch in our country, and this is the court responsible for qualifying the elections in the last instance of deputies and Senate, and of the person holding the presidency of the Republic. This obviously extinguishes the political qualification of the president election to establish a legal one of the presidential election. This qualification stage, in accordance with the law, begins with a stage of results and validity statements, which is the last stage of the electoral process, with the submission of documents and electoral files to the district councils, with all of the resolutions issued by the Electoral Tribunal of the Judicial Branch of the Federation. Moreover, it sets for this stage that it is the Superior Chamber that must carry out the final calculation and the statement of validity to deliver the certificate to the person elected as president. Being the first time that our country will have an elected president, already elected, already with this assignment, it shows that the ballots needs to be done based on the sum of the results that are recorded in the tally sheets of 300 electoral districts. Those that were impeached and confirmed, and those that were also modified through nonconformity claims for the electoral process. I'd also like to highlight that we had 54,212 ballots. Compared to this is 31.77% of polling stations. We installed more than 170,000 polling stations that were approved, and 116,403 electoral packages, equivalent to 68.23%. This was a count of 70% of votes in the country regarding presidential election. Regarding the results of the district counting for the presidential election, there were challenges from several parties such as Movimiento Ciudadano, PRD, PRI, and PAN. This special commission was created to work on all the challenges and impeachments related to the presidential election. This was constituted on June 17 of this year, made up of 2 electoral magistrates. The General Secretariat worked on the draft of the final counting, and they had August 31st as deadline to solve all of the nonconformity claims. However, this situation was brought forward because they have to resolve it in advance, and the statement was made on August 12 with a unanimous vote at the Superior Chamber, and it confirmed the result related to the renewal of the incumbent to the presidency. There were some irregularities announced that could have generated a different result from the one obtained with this vote. So the Superior Chamber itself told us that over 240 nonconformity claims against the district counting were resolved, 2 trials, and 1 judgment of citizens as well. At the end, it was determined by the Superior Chamber that the candidate Claudia Sheinbaum Pardo obtained the majority of votes by receiving 35,924,519, which represents 59.76%, and candidate Xochitl Galvez received 16.5 million votes. With this certificate, we can see that everything related to the electoral process for the renewal of the presidency of the Republic ends, and we are in the last stage of the challenges received for the integration of the Congress of the Union, especially what's related to the assignment of proportional representation that the General Council of the INE carried out last Friday. It was quite a complicated and polarized session due to different interpretations and reflections regarding how it will be formed according to the Superior Chamber. And they also need to resolve this week this issue because the Congress begins its functions on September 1st. So they have little time to solve all this. And I think the debate is quite valid, as well as the reflections. We have analyzed, we listened, we have met with political parties, civil society organizations, citizens, and I think the decision was made with the majority in the General Council regarding the application of Articles 54 and 56 of the Constitution, which led to determine, well, first of all, the false debate, and we all saw it on the networks, is that a no to overrepresentation. Overrepresentation is endorsed by the Constitution. Article 54 states that political parties may have a representation of over 8 points of the result of their votes. So overrepresentation is already embedded in our constitutions. We are living in a mixed system with a majority of preponderance, with 60% of provincial councils are elected through this route, and the other 40% through the proportionality route. However, today, with the analyses and the application we made, all parties are overrepresented. Another important issue for this this debate is how these deputies should be assigned to political parties or coalitions. Coalitions do not exist in the parliamentary sphere. They are only there for electoral competition. They are created for the purposes of electoral competition and specifically for electoral campaigns. And just to conclude, I will say that the Superior Chamber itself has interpreted that the allocation of spaces through the plurinominal route is only for political parties. So this means that many arguments that we heard on this occasion, we heard them before. Many statements have been stated by the court and the Superior Chamber regarding this assignment, and we may or may not agree with it. And if we do not agree, we need to challenge it and change the constitutional and legal order to move towards another system. Thank you. Thank you so much, Councillor. I'd like to give the floor to Luis Fernandez.
Muchísimas gracias, Antonio. Muy buen día a todos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much,
por la
Antonio.
invitación.
Good morning,
gustaría hacer
everyone.
varios
Thank you so
apuntes,
much for this
después de
invitation.
escuchar a
And I
la
have
consejera,
several
creo que
points
explicar
to
de manera muy
mention
clara
after
cómo
listening
funciona-
to
cómo funciona el
Counselor.
proceso
I
de la
think it's
calificación presidencial en México,
very
un poco
needed
esta
that we
discusión
explain
reciente de la
clearly how the presidential
Me
qualification
gustaría
process
ponerles en
works in
contexto a las
Mexico
personas que
and
nos
this
escuchan
issue
todo
on
lo que pasó a lo
overrepresentation. So
largo
I
del
would
año
like to
previo
set the
al-
context on
digamos,
what
previo
happened
a
throughout
la
the year
calificación o previo
prior
incluso a la elección,
to the
que sucedió el 2 de
qualification or
junio.
even the
Y
elections
es que desde un año
that took
antes,
place on
incluso
June
antes que
2nd.
iniciara el proceso electoral,
Because even 1 year
vimos a
before,
muchos actores
before
políticos,
starting
iniciando por el
the
presidente
electoral
de la
process, we
República,
saw many
que
political actors
iniciaron
starting
con el-
with the
iniciaron
president
con las
of the
campañas, con
Republic,
las campañas
who
anticipadas para
started
el
with
arranque
the
de-
campaigns
del
or
proceso. Desde
early
2 años
campaigns
antes
rather
incluso
for
salieron los
the
nombres,
start of the process.
pusieron
Even
sobre
2
la mesa
years
los
ago,
nombres de las personas que
we
podrían
we
competir
had
para
the
la
names.
elección
The names
presidencial.
came out of
Y
those
vimos
who
a un
could compete
conjunto
for
de
the
actores
presidential election.
políticos
And
actuar
we
fuera
saw
de las
a
reglas
set of
electorales.
political
Esto me parece muy
actors acting
importante, me
outside
parece
the
muy
electoral
importante
rules.
apuntarlo,
And I think this is very
porque sucedió
important
esto antes de
to
que iniciara el proceso
mention.
el 7 de septiembre,
Because this
formalmente.
happened
Incluso
before
meses
the
antes,
process of September
hicieron un
7th,
proceso
when
para
it
la
formally
selección de
began.
coordinadores
Even
de
a few
coalición
months before,
que,
there was a
digamos, que
process
fue
for the
informalmente
coalition
el banderazo de
coordination,
salida
coordinator
para el
selection
proceso
that
electoral del
was the starting
2024.
signal
Y
for the
las
2024 electoral
autoridades desde ese
process.
momento quedaron rebasadas. Y me
From
refiero al
that
Instituto Nacional
point, the
Electoral y al Tribunal
authorities
Electoral,
were
porque
overwhelmed.
tenían muy
I
pocas
mean, the National
herramientas,
Electoral
incluso en ese
Institute and
momento,
the Electoral Tribunal, because they had very few tools at
este
that
proceso
time
electoral anticipado,
to be
que
able
debió
to
incluso
contain
debió
this
contemplarse ya
early
en la
electoral
calificación
process,
presidencial
which
que hizo el
should have
tribunal,
been
en semanas
even
recientes.
taken into
Inicia el
account
proceso
in the
electoral
presidential
en septiembre,
qualification
avanza el
recent
periodo
weeks
del
ago.
inicio de la
So
organización de la
the
elección.
period starts
Y
in September, and we start organizing
la
the
idea es con
elections,
el
and
espíritu, las
there's the
precampañas, de poder
period of
generar
pre-campaigns
competencia interna al interior de los
where
partidos,
there's
al
the
interior de las
idea and the
coaliciones.
spirit of
Eso había
having
sucedido meses
a
antes.
internal
Y las
competition within the
precampañas se
parties
concentraron
or
con
within the
candidaturas
coalitions that
juntas.
happened
Esto
a
me
few
parece muy
months before,
importante,
and the
también
pre-campaigns
ponerlo sobre la mesa. Las
centered
candidaturas
in
únicas
were
se dieron
centered
ya
in
por la
single
coalición
candidacies.
formada.
This
Hoy
is
la
very
coalición
important because
ganadora, que era
the
entre
single
Morena,
candidacies already
Partido
happened
Verde y
because of
Partido
the
del Trabajo,
coalition
y
formed
compitió
today, which
únicamente,
were Morena,
únicamente
the Green
Claudia
Party, and the
Sheinbaum.
Labour
En
Party,
realidad
and
era
only
un
Claudia
proceso
Sheinbaum
de
competed,
campaña ya
which
formal
in
por
reality
parte de la
was
coalición
a formal
opositora en ese
campaign
momento,
process
el PRI, PAN,
by
PRD, ya
the
compitió
opposition
solamente Xochitl
coalition.
Gálvez, y
And at that
Movimiento
time,
Ciudadano tuvo
the
dos
PRI,
candidaturas,
PAN,
digamos que
and
dos
PRD
candidaturas
competed
únicas,
only
uno
with
que se
Xochitl
bajó
Gálvez, and
a las
Movimiento
semanas de
Ciudadano
iniciar,
had
y
two
después
candidacies,
el
two
candidato que
unique
acabó compitiendo.
candidacies, one who
Pero de
dropped
nuevo,
out a
pasando
few
por
weeks
encima al
and the
menos
other
del
one
espíritu, la idea que
who
está
ended up
detrás
competing.
de las
But
precampañas, de las competencias
definitely
internas.
passing over the
En el periodo
spirit
intercampañas,
behind the
las tres
pre-campaigns
candidaturas
and
también
internal
pasan por encima de
competitions.
las,
Also, during
digamos,
this
viven
period,
en la
the three
línea de las reglas
candidacies
electorales.
go
Y
over
generaron
or they
procesos,
live
digamos, algunos
in
hicieron que
line
se tuvieron
or at
espacios
the
de
edge of
comunicación en
electoral
redes,
rules and generated
hicieron un
processes,
podcast,
for
programas de
example,
radio, espacios que
communication
brindaban la
space.
posibilidad de
They
estar
were on
constantemente en
networks, on
campaña y seguir
podcasts,
compartiendo
radio programs,
los
so they
mensajes.
had the opportunity
Todos
to
estos casos
constantly
llegan
be
claramente a las
on
autoridades
campaign
electorales,
and convey
y
those
las sanciones
messages.
no son
All of these
suficientes para poder
cases
contener
reached
el
the electoral
comportamiento,
authorities. However,
digamos, el comportamiento
sanctions
atípico de
are
los
not
actuales
enough to contain that behavior of political actors systematically violating the law. And so the campaigns have free reign established by electoral laws to generate the competition that went from March until the last day of May. And then we had the election day. I want to point out that all of these elements, and an additional element that I want to share, we are talking about political actors who compete. In this case, the president, in all stages, in all spaces that he has of communication, with over 35 sanctions established by the Electoral Tribunal of the judicial branch, referred to his candidate and tipped the scales supporting her. And many of these elements, what the Electoral Tribunal says, is that it wasn't enough to be able to assume that they would have changed the result of the election, because it had an impressive difference in votes. If the margin had been smaller, perhaps the legal dispute would have been different. In spite of that, measuring the influence that the intervention of the president or other political actors could have is very complicated. How much does it mean in terms of votes? Let's say this long-lasting support and communicating it through social programs, mentioning it every day in the morning press conferences, where he has this huge presidential arena and huge communication capacity. So how can we measure that impact in votes? It's also very difficult to have an alternative opposition. So these two elements get combined and the margin grows. And there's another interesting element that continues in the public discussion, which is that on February 5th of this year, the president presented a package of 18 constitutional reforms and 2 legislative reforms. These were adopted as a campaign program for the presidential candidate at that time, now president-elect. So they took that, and that allowed many other political stakeholders from the federal, executive, and legislative branches to campaign in parallel, defending that agenda, and not necessarily calling for a vote for a female candidate, but activating that structure in order to do the campaign. So I think that this element for the presidential qualification was considerably underestimated due to the number of stakeholders who entered. And regarding the overrepresentation, I can talk about it a bit later. We have already had a discussion. Everything is still under the decision of the electoral council, and I agree with her in the fact that the constitution is very clear. The article clearly says that it refers to political parties and not coalitions. They are the ones who are given the proportional representation, despite an interpretation that I'm sure Javier will be able to delve into more clearly regarding the contradictions that exist in the constitutional articles. Today, the majority of the Electoral Council decided to go for a practically verbatim interpretation of the Constitution to be able to define the assignment of deputies by means of proportional representation. We still have the political and legal debate in the Electoral Tribunal that would take place this week. That would be all, Antonio. Thank you so much, Luis. Javier, you have the floor. Thank you so much as well for the invitation. I'll try to be brief because I know that we don't have a lot of time and many issues have been put on the table. So, as a counselor very kindly gave us an overview of the qualification to the presidential election, but if I had to summarize what we saw in this legislative and presidential elections, I would say that we have a absolute resounding victory. There's no doubt about who triumphed in the presidential and legislative elections, but I should also say that we lived an electoral process that was deeply inequitable, where the framework that governs the development of the electoral process was repeatedly and systematically breached. So I would say it's a combination, first of all, of the political actors, but also the electoral authorities, and specifically the electoral tribunal. As Luis already mentioned, these were authentic early campaigns or pre-campaigns, however you want to call them, which clearly breached the legal framework that existed and that governed electoral times. Some voices spoke up during the debate and said that there was a vacuum, it wasn't regulated, so what the electoral authority did was to regulate this space with no rules. And I don't think so. The logic of pre-campaigns and the sanctions of anticipated acts of pre-campaigns, they look to have some time where there can be both pre-campaigns and campaigns, starting from before with public resources or others that are not taxed, and so they could have an advantage on this. So this is something that the electoral tribunal explicitly endorsed. So what I see is not only a court that was not flexible with that was flexible with the interpretation of the rules, and it simply allowed that the legal framework not to be complied with. I think that's where part of the inequity of the electoral process started. And paradoxically, a systematic intervention by the President of the Republic, as well as other political shareholders. But I want to mention this paradox within the constitutional framework because we see a very clear intervention of political shareholders that in other democratic models would be impossible to think of, and it would because they're very restrictive. But this is a framework that comes from claims at the time the opposition candidate that was Andrés Manuel López Obrador. During the 2006 presidential election, we didn't see an intervention by former President Vicente Fox and other political shareholders, which obviously narrowed the result in 2006 with less than 1%. So there was a serious approach on the part of coalition that lost the elections and that López Obrador headed to say that this election had to be annulled because there was an undue intervention of political actors. So in 2006, the electoral authority recognizes that there was an intervention and that the election was at risk, but says that they do not have enough elements to know if those violations were decisive or not. It's also important to point out that afterwards there was a constitutional reform that explicitly seeks to limit this type of intervention based on this illegitimate claims. So the model may seem right or wrong to us, but that's the model we have. On one side, we saw the inability of the authorities to stop the intervention by the president, largely due to a legislative omission. This means we should have a clearer regulation that would give tools to the authority to establish those limits. But in terms of the qualification, I think that one of the most questionable issues is that it was the President of the Republic refused to recognize this systemic intervention. And I think that with an election where the triumph was resounding, it was practically impossible to annul because The criteria established by the Constitution and the law to annul an election is that those decisions have to be decisive and that they have to affect the result. I think it would be very difficult to prove that aspect, and it's something that empirically was very difficult to show in trials and more. I do think it's a missed opportunity for the electoral authorities to have a record on many problems that our electoral system has and that we have had from the past. So we have seen that many electoral reforms in Mexico have tried to solve problems that arise through the elections, and we see that it's very dynamic, and a good part of the source that have been used historically for these reforms are precisely the decisions of the courts, and unfortunately the electoral authorities did not do it in that sense. And regarding the overrepresentation, I think we can say a lot of things, but we needed to be brief. So if it's okay with you, Antonio, I'll leave it for the second round. Thank you. That's great, Javier. I actually have a question for you later on overrepresentation. Thank you very much. And now that we heard what you said, Javier, and Counselor Du, that you have to leave earlier due to work commitments, I would like to start with you. We have mentioned several laws that limit the intervention of public officials in electoral campaigns. And these laws were precisely designed for the intervention of previous presidents and who at the time were strongly criticized by President López Obrador. My question to you is how effective the precautionary measures and sanctions issued by the INE have been against public officials and the president, and what else can the INE do to ensure that in the future these interventions of public officials in electoral campaigns can be stopped more effectively in accordance with the Mexican Constitution, including those of the President of the Republic. Counselor? Well, thank you for the question. First of all, I'd like to address several things because we mentioned very important issues. First of all, it is true that a promotion of candidates began in June, and we began to supervise this activity and follow up on it, but the electoral authority decided that it was an internal political process of the political parties that stemmed from the growing interest of citizens. So these movements were endorsed, and we just audited expenses and behaviors, what could be done, what could not be done, and they had to report on the agenda and the expenses. Of course, an electoral process is never the same as other. I am not endorsing it or anything. I'm just saying that we need to comply with the electoral tribunal determination, which in this case they said were internal political process. They were valid and not considered as pre-campaigns. Second, I think there are many novelties in this election process that are worth highlighting, such as voting in pre-trial detention, face-to-face voting in consulates, early voting, compliance with the principle of parity, even beyond 50% and 57% recording in pre-trial detention, and etc. And third, I would say that regarding the intervention of public officials, and answering to your question, we have a special sanctioning procedure in which the INE only determines precautionary measures. We do not determine the merits of the matter. This means that INE does not sanction. The system is designed so that it is a specialized regional chamber, which is the electoral tribunal of the judiciary itself, who get to determine whether a public official is responsible or not. We can only relieve the procedure and issue precautionary measures. It seems to me that precautionary measures, there was even some anger from the presidential headquarters because he was forced to put up signs or to lower parts of signs, and when it can be segmented in some local elections, they wouldn't be broadcasted in the morning press conference. So we tried to contain this space that the Superior Chamber itself said it was a innovative exercise of communication on part of the presidency, and that no electoral rules were breached. Rather, it was necessary to analyze case by case and all the expressions that are given each morning to see if they breach the electoral framework or not. This means that it's ex post. We cannot do any censorship before because we don't know what he'll talk about. So we have to come in after the statements were made. And third of all, we need to be realistic because in this country, no one sanctions the President of the Republic. Second, laws are made by political parties, and there is a legislative omission with respect to Article 134 that has reached almost 2 decades with that legislative omission. So we need to ask ourselves who makes the rules according to which they compete. What have the electoral authorities done? They have provided us with tools to make visible these activities, for example, monitoring, following up, supervising, and even some decalogues of rules of what they can do. They can go to an event, but they cannot promote a campaign. But in fact, to other public officials, there is a way to sanction them through a fine or with in cases in which they violate some things, or we can take away their space or TV sets. But if we're talking about the president and the morning press conferences, then we need to make sure that our legal system, as it's pronounced, changes, because for now there is no sanction imposed to the President of the Republic. So what sanction is there for the head of the executive branch? That's what we need to start thinking about. Do we want to keep the model of political communication of the 1917, in which no one can have access to radio and television, no one can buy spaces and media, or rather, do we want, as we had before, everyone can have access and the media can also behave as players in the electoral process? Because before, a spot was sold to a party in 1 peso, and to the opposite party it was sold at 1,500 pesos, the same spot with the same time. So there are many questions that should be asked, and we need to come up with the answers from a space of analytical reflection, not with plan A, plan B, plan C. There are many questions that need to arise to see if this model fits with what we want as a country. And also, to that effect, the president has this space every morning, and as National Electoral Institute, we weren't able to broadcast on radio and television. The media broadcast the morning press conference held by the president. But what happened if the media said, you know what, we will no longer broadcast the morning press conference? There would be no dissemination. What is being sanctioned is the dissemination, not that a public official can open a bridge because it has to be opened, but rather that the public program can benefit or can be seen as a pre-campaign that benefits certain political party. There's no way to separate government activities because we are in a campaign. What we cannot do is disseminate. So I think we need to start raising these issues to see towards where we can go with the regulation and the tools that we can have as electoral authorities, which in the end can always be challenged and will or will not have to be validated by the Superior Chamber. And I'd like to apologize because I have to leave. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you so much, Counselor, for your words, for participating, and for providing this realistic analysis in this hyper-presidential system in Mexico. And you're absolutely right. The laws are made by political parties. Thank you so much for being with us. We know that you have a very complicated agenda, so thank you so much for being us. And Javier, I'd like to go back to the overrepresentation. Experts have pointed out, as stated by the INE, that overrepresentation would entail a hegemonic party similar to the PRI, considering that a supermajority was not seen since the presidency of Miguel de la Madrid in 1982, so almost 40 years ago. What impact could the overrepresentation have on democracy in Mexico? If the appeal of challenge introduced by the Electoral Tribunal does not succeed, how would overrepresentation affect the balance of powers in Mexico? I think this is the most important question, Antonio, and let me just take a step back. If we had not seen these levels of political dominance of a single political force in Mexico, which is obviously due to the result of the polls, to the fact that we have been moving slowly with many ups and downs in a in what we can still call a democratic system in Mexico, but also because express constitutional restrictions. If we were to review the 1993 reform, which basically was carried out by the PRI in a period of hegemony where President Carlos Salinas de Gortari was profoundly popular and when the PRI had a great dominance at the Congress. It is the PRI of the 90s that decides to tie its own hands and establishes a clause or a provision in the Constitution that in 1993 stated that no political party could have more than 315 deputies. If you do the calculation in a Congress with 500 deputies, it generated that no political party could have over 63% of the votes. So it would not reach 2/3, which is the magic figure in Mexico. In Mexico, to carry out a constitutional reform or any important changes, the Constitution requires 2/3 or 66.6% of votes. With those restrictions, they get tougher in 1996. The top number of deputies drops to 300, and this clause, of which everyone, or not everyone, but many experts have been talking about for many years, where it's stated that no political party can have a percentage of legislative seats that is greater than 8 points over the vote. So I think this is why we hadn't seen it. What's interesting about the overrepresentation, and I think it could cover a whole webinar on its own, the most important aspect I would like to set on the table is that it's not a typical, novel, or extravagant that the cap is interpreted as applying to both parties and coalitions. In fact, this is the case in the 2000 presidential election. there is still a criteria where it clearly says that political party was understood by the superior chamber as coalition as well, because they knew that the purpose of those reforms, the one from 1993 and 1996, was to prevent a single political force to be able to make any constitutional reforms, as well as any other appointments or other types of acts that require the qualified majority of 2/3 by the Constitution. So the wording of the Constitution has not changed. What has changed is the secondary legislation and the interpretation of the electoral authorities. Unfortunately, I think that the interpretation that the electoral authorities have made is what has allowed political parties do, which technically or legally can be seen as fraud, because the coalition regime, which is perfectly legal, is mixed with a principle that is contrary, opposed to the purposes of both of them. So the debate that we have seen over these months have to do with that. If we are going into a textual, formalistic interpretation, or if we are going to interpret as political parties and coalitions. And Antonio, I think that there has been some inconsistency, because if we want to get textual and formalistic, then we need to be consistently textual and formalistic. And the truth is that when we interpret the Constitution in a literal way is a bit nonsense. An example, Section 1 of that same article says that each party has to present a series of candidacies of relative majority to have access to proportional representation. And if you read political party and you say, oh, it's political party, it doesn't say coalition, then the consequence would be a bit absurd, because neither the Morena coalition nor the opposition coalition, PRI, PAN, and PRD, could have access to proportional representation. The only political party that could have access is Movimiento Ciudadano. So if we want to get textual, then we would have to take away all of the plurinominals from Morena and the bulk of the opposition. There are other certain rules that we would have to apply to the letter, which would take away some victories from other parties. So all this to say that there is an important, interesting, and relevant legal debate, and we'll see what the Electoral Tribunal decides. And according to the other question, I would say that the qualified majority is the key that removes all the locks from the Constitution. Mexico has a constitution that is rigid in theory, but that is very flexible in practice. However, it is a constitution that has been reformed based on the consensus of a good part of political forces, both in the government and the opposition, from 1997 to date. That has been the rule. If the overrepresentation with over 16 or 18% of coalition in Chamber of Deputies were to be endorsed, and if it's true that in the Senate, as a senator said yesterday, that they already have the qualified majority in the Senate, so they would have both chambers, I think that we would be opening Pandora's box. What could happen? Anything could happen, or nothing could happen. All 18 constitutional reforms initiatives presented by the President López Obrador be approved? Yes. Could we be left with a judicial reform that ends with the independence of judges and magistrates? We could have an electoral reform that dismantles the conditions of electoral competition. We could have a reform that disappears practically or a good part of the autonomous bodies that are dedicated to regulate economic competition and telecommunications. Yes, it could happen. We could see the reform that now militarized and in functional terms the National Guard, and it could generate consensus within the coalition of Morena, Labour Party, and Green Party. I think consequences could be so dramatic that we could end up with a constitution reform without necessarily going through a process of convening a constituent assembly, because at least during these 3 years, at least between now and 2027, the ruling party would have the key that removes all locks on the Constitution. I'll leave it at that, Antonio. Thank you so much, Javier. I would like to have some questions for our participants. I have a couple of questions for you, Luis, but I don't know, Emilio, do you have any questions from our audience in the Twitter sphere or X? If so, please let me know. Also, if you have questions, you can raise your hand and you can activate your microphone if I get to see you. I do see a question in the chat. Let me read it. Question: the INE and the Electoral Tribunal are co-opted, and we're all victims of a state election. My perception is that we're living in an electoral autocracy. The INE, more than representing citizens, justifies the actions. Mrs. Carla Humphrey's conflict of interest is clear, and that I agree publicly. And I show it publicly. I don't know if any of you have a comment or answer. This is the only comment we have received via Zoom.
Si quieres tú, Luis, porque yo acabo de hablar.
Luis, if you want to go first. Thank you, Javier. Luis, go ahead. Sure, Antonio, I can react to that. And let me say that there is a justified perception of the electoral institutions as co-opted. And let me begin that the National Electoral Institute, with its 11 recently renewed councils, had a very radical process for the selection of 4 recent councillors. For those of you who do not know the process, these 4 councillors were recently elected by chance. There was a selection process in Congress. There was no consensus reached, as Javier mentioned, to get to the position. So they didn't reach the majority, and in the last stage, they decided to do a tombola, and that's how the 4 councillors were selected, including current president Guadalupe Tadei, who did not reach within the council the majority of 8 votes from 11 councils to appoint the vacant positions within the National Electoral Institute. And so she had to appoint someone in charge of the office. And so these heads of office, some of them do not have the credentials expected, some of them are more aligned to the president of the National Electoral Institute, and so they would question many of the decisions. With Javier, in another event that we shared at the National Agreement for Electoral Integrity, we discussed the authorization of special sanctioning processes and the contentious technical unit, which allowed many things to happen inside. This is like the dispatch manager, especially the decisions related to the ruling party. So that's a very sensitive aspect, and it does give a perception of inequity, bias, or preferences towards the ruling party. In addition to divided votes in most of the decisions, especially the most controversial ones, such as the overrepresentation last week. I don't know if our audience knows that the in the
se sucedió un
electoral
cambio, le llamamos un
tribunal,
golpe,
there was a
le
change,
llamamos un golpe de
sort
Estado,
of a
pero no es
coup
claramente, no es la
d'etat,
palabra,
although
pero hubo un
that's not
cambio de
the word. There
titulares
was a
por
change
presiones
of
políticas
headlines due to political
en
pressures
diciembre del
in
año
December
pasado.
of
Y
last
cambió
year.
el
And
presidente
so the president
que en ese
changed.
momento
At
llevaba el
that
tribunal,
time,
Reyes
it was
Mondragón,
Reyes
por
Mondragon,
presiones
and due
políticas
to
del
political
resto
pressure
de otros
from
magistrados y magistradas electorales
other
hicieron
magistrates and electoral
el
magistrates,
cambio de presidencia.
made the
No
change of
había razón
presidency.
alguna por la que
There was
pudiera
no
renunciar.
reason
Era
why
el
he could
único método
resign.
que,
It was
digamos, la
the
única
only
forma en la que
way
podían cambiar
that
la
they could
presidencia era
change
que
the
él renunciara
presidency. He
explícitamente
needed
por
to
razones,
resign explicitly
por razones
for
graves.
serious
Y sin
reasons.
existirlas y sin
And
poder
without
justificarlas, renunció después de
existing
muchas
and
presiones a
without
lo
being
largo de
able
un
to
mes
justify them,
complejo,
he
y entra una
resigned
nueva
after a
presidenta
lot
que
of pressure
es Mónica Soto.
over
Y
a
la
month.
magistrada,
And now
junto
we
con
have the new president, Mónica Soto,
magistraturas adicionales,
and along with two additional magistracies, Felipe Fuente and Felipe de la Mata, have built a majority for decision making. So the court would have to be appointed with 7 magistrates. There were 5, so it was incomplete. And now these 5 magistrates make up a majority of 3 against 2 over many decisions. Once again, most of the controversial decisions we saw in recent months were voted 3 to 2. And I think this is also asymptomatic. It's part of the feeling and perception of institutional co-opting that causes electoral authorities to lose legitimacy, to lose public recognition, to be able to make decisions, objective decisions around electoral processes. And so I think that would be my reaction to this issue,
Muchas gracias,
Antonio.
Luis. Por
Thank you
cuestiones de
so
tiempo,
much,
creo que
Luis.
hay otra pregunta. Me gustaría llamar
There
a Ann
are
Wakefield.
other
Por favor,
questions. I would
Annie,
like
perdón.
to give the floor to
Su
Anne
pregunta.
Wakefield. Your question, please.
Sí, me estaba preguntando
Thank you.
por
I
qué
was just wondering
la reunión
why
dejó el tema de la
the organizers of the
sobrerepresentación para un
meeting
momento
left the
que ya no
topic
podía
of
responder,
overrepresentation at a
Carla
time
Humphrey.
when Carla Humphrey could not answer.
Javier o
Javier,
¿quieren
Luis, would you like to answer?
No, creo que estás en
Ya.
mute,
Perdón.
Javier.
No, pero entiendo que la pregunta es ¿por qué
So
ya
I think
no
the
pudo
question is
contestar
why
Carla
Carla Humphrey wasn't able to answer the
tema o-
overrepresentation question?
Esa es la pregunta, Annie.
Is that the question, Annie?
¿Por qué se planeó de esta
Why was it
manera?
organized this way?
No,
El-
creo que fue más bien ahí Ann, creo que
And
fue
I think it
voluntario.
was unintentional.
Tenía agenda y la pregunta la hicieron,
Councillor Humphrey
la hicieron
had
posterior. No
time
es un tema que
constraints
no
and the
tuviera
question
respuesta,
was
al contrario,
asked
creo que lo hubiera respondido,
later on.
pero
I don't think
creo que
she
no
would
era-
have had
no
a
algo que
problem
hubiera
with that.
planeado de
She would have answered. It
Exactamente.
wasn't planned like
Exactamente. Ella
this.
tenía que salir a las-
Yes,
no
she
puede
needed
media
to
hora de
leave
México,
at
salió un poquito
9:30 a.m.
después,
Mexico City
y
time.
era por,
She left a bit later,
por
but
eso,
that's
no por ninguna
the only
otra,
reason.
razón. Pues, mira.
Okay, thank
Sí,
you.
por supuesto, Annie. Y aquí hay un comentario
We
que
have
leo
a
antes de
comment
concluir,
that I would like to
de
read
Juan
before
Francisco
ending the
Torres
session
Landa
from
Rufo, que
Juan
dice, "El
Francisco
problema,
Torres Landa
bien,
Rufo.
el problema central
The
de lo que
main
decidió el
problem
INE y
of
ahora
what the
revisa
INE
el
decided
TRIFE
and now
es
reviewed
que
by
en los
TRIFE
hechos
is
están
that in fact
convirtiendo
they
la
are
elección
turning the
ordinaria
ordinary
en una de
election
carácter
into
constituyente.
a
Esto no
constituent
está permitido en
nature
la
one. This is
Constitución
not
y, sin
allowed in the
embargo, así lo
Constitution
están
and yet they are
permitiendo.
allowing
Es
it.
el
It is the
derrumbe de los
collapse
controles de
of
convivencia
controls
en el
of
país. Nos
coexistence in
pueden
the country. They
orillar a
can
un
push
punto
us
de rompimiento
to a
civil
point
al
of civil rupture
vulnerar
by
los derechos
violating the
humanos
most
más
basic
elementales.
human
El
rights.
TRIFE aún puede evitar
The
este
TRIFE can still
debate.
avoid this debacle.
No sé si hay alguna reacción.
Any reactions before we conclude?
No, a ver, yo creo que lo que está planteando,
So,
¿no?
I think that this
comentario
comment
es cierto, ¿no? Digamos,
is
yo creo que
true.
Francisco tiene
I
la razón de
think
que
that
ese es el
Francisco
¿no?
might feel that effect, although it's clear that the Constitution does not say that a single electoral force cannot make constitutional reforms on its own. But I think that the purpose of those reforms, the 93 and the 96, was precisely that. And I think that at a time such as this one, constitutional courts such as the Superior Chamber, closing court, not even the Supreme Court can review this decision. So they are there not only to read the Constitution as a cooking recipe or instruction for an appliance, but as a document that seeks to achieve certain purposes. The interpretation in Mexico, the United States, and the world is something that courts do in a recurring basis. The interpretation, as we saw in the Superior Chamber in 2000 and other matters. So I think that legally, that is what is being requested. We are not asking them to invent a rule, at least not what I'm defending, but to return to that interpretation that was already made in the year 2000, not because of the political effects, but because legally that was the reform, what we wanted to achieve with the reform. And some of us think that courts are there for that precisely. That's all. Thank you so much, Javier. And before we end, there is a very interesting question from Cecia Escobar from Monterrey. She says, how do you recommend socializing this issue that becomes very technical to the general population? Luis, would you like to answer this last question? Yes, Antonio, thank you very much. I think we tried to do so in several ways. Juan Francisco Torres Lana, who raised the question on this side, makes an extraordinary effort to call on citizens, collect signatures, bring the discussion to in public terms through the UNE organization. So I think there are several organizations such as this one that helps to socialize information in a less technical way. The discussion on overrepresentation that is active in the discussion is very complex because of its effect, not because of the legal reading that Javier shares, but the effects sometimes are easier to communicate, and there are a couple of facts that are important. For example, Morena has 27 of 32 state congresses, a majority in 27 of 32, and has 24 of 32 governorships. So it's not only a qualified majority in the lower chamber or upper chamber, but they also have majority in 27 and has territorial control through many local governments that won. And there was an impact because from what we can observe in the behavior of the political party is that it is governed by two values that have been complex for democracy, which are discipline and loyalty. Morena works with a lot of discipline and a lot of loyalty and hierarchical structures. Sometimes with clearly differences, keeping proportions, but it's similar as military structures. There's a discipline that is expected of political actors. And now there's a nuance that I'd like to mention here with overrepresentation. There is a discussion, and it's not that I'm in favor or against. These are not parties that I would publicly support, but the Labour Party and Green Party are parties that are allied and that assume themselves as independent. What does it mean to be assumed as independent? It means that they are not structured, they are not under Morena's hierarchical line. They do have agreements, close agreements, that make them parties aligned politically. But the coalition, let me emphasize that it is possible that it can be modified. The Green Party has been a party that has modified and that has changed according to the ruling party, and I don't want to give a false hope that this can be broken, but it does lead us to reflect on how we regulate party coalitions from the Constitution, as Councillor Carla Humphrey has said, but also in secondary laws to be clear on the agreements and how far they can go, because today that is the agreement that allows the Constitution to be changed with a majority and not necessarily Morena. So to go back to the answer, I think that these ideas must be socialized through civil society organizations, share the risks and consequences as clearly as possible, and to take our responsibility as citizens to take these arguments, socialize it, and have an electoral impact as well as in political
Muchas
forces.
gracias, Luis,
Thank you so much, Luis, for that comment. And it is true, it's very important to socialize this, and it can be done in a very easy way so that people can better understand it. And we have come to the end of our conversation. We have heard from our prominent panelists on several topics, such as the parliamentary overrepresentation that could have anti-democratic consequences and deny the separation between institutions and the rule of law. How compatible would a Mexico be with a democracy of damaged freedoms in the face of challenges of security, transparency, and freedoms, especially the claims of a younger population inserting in the dynamism of today's North America. Also, self-control on part of the ruler, who today constitute a majority, not only with respect of minorities, which is a fundamental pillar for democracy, but also to preserve intact justice and freedom, which are indispensable elements for the development and well-being of Mexico and Mexicans. We are very grateful to the Mexico Institute of the Woodrow Wilson Center for organizing this rich discussion that is part of a series that I mentioned earlier, of great importance to better understand the challenges of what our neighbor Mexico is going through, and of course our participants. Thank you so much, Councillor Carla Humphrey, Luis Fernandez, and Javier Martin. Thank you for your time and for sharing your knowledge on these issues that are so complex but also so important for the strengthening of democracy and governability. So thank you very much to you all, and excellent day, everyone. We will be in touch to follow up on this important discussion. Thank you, everyone.